Well, good morning, and welcome to the press conference for the launch of Strategic Survey 2012, the annual review of world affairs by the IISS. We think it's important at least once a year to examine global events with some perspective and to isolate those specific trends out of the melange of international activity that will have an important impact. Strategic Survey performs that task. It provides also an ever-ready companion for those needing an authoritative assessment of strategic issues in any region of the world. Joining me today to answer your questions after this statement are Alex Nichol, Adam Ward, Mark Fitzpatrick, Tim Huxley, Rahul Roy Chowdhury, Nick Redman, Emil Hokayem, Ben Barry, and James Hackett. This year's Strategic Survey carries special essays on intelligence agencies and the cyber world, African defense cooperation, and the impact of economic sanctions on Iran. Our strategic geography section covers themes as diverse as the US pivot to Asia, Mali's growing insecurity, Myanmar's ethnic conflicts, and Central America's drug strife. The past year has been one of uncertain transitions and hectic crisis management diplomacy. Weakness and fragility have been the greatest threats to stability and growth, the diffusion of power and lack of leadership, the greatest barriers to diplomatic or economic problem solving. Old certainties and recent conventional wisdoms about international affairs are now under persistent challenge. The questions being asked are fundamental. Will the Eurozone and the European Union survive in their current shape? What will be the balance of power in the Middle East, given a resurgent Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and deepening internal conflict in Syria? Can a new generation of Chinese leaders cope with the internal contradictions of the Chinese polity and a possible slowdown in growth? While rising powers in Asia and South America seem to be getting closer to the top of the global power hierarchy, do they know what to do when they get there? On what issues is American power still crucial? These and a legion of other questions with multiple possible answers are so constantly being asked that global affairs seem inherently unstable. They are the themes that we addressed in Strategic Survey 2012. Geoeconomically, it was the debate over the future of the euro, of course, that dominated the year. In the year ahead, the debate on how the euro is saved will become hard to distinguish from the debate over how Europe should be shaped. Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany has announced a race against the markets to establish a fiscal union and a common domestic policy in Europe in order to save the euro. Non-Eurozone countries have an interest in encouraging a process that can stabilize the currency long term, but the same countries, and the United Kingdom in particular, will want to ensure the independence of their fiscal and monetary decision-taking while maintaining access to the single market. It will take some effort of mutual diplomatic restraint to ensure that the relations between the Eurozone and non-Eurozone countries do not turn into a game of Russian roulette. The UK or others cannot use the crisis to renegotiate the parts of its EU membership it does not like, while Germany or others cannot try to use the crisis to squeeze non-Eurozone countries into a political union that they cannot accept. The logic of the situation suggests that an inner core of Eurozone countries and multiple outer core of non-Eurozone countries with different relations to the European centre be established. This would preserve the euro and keep a wider community of European nations together. But a Europe of concentric circles, once favoured by personalities such as former French Premier Edouard Balladur, is perhaps too logical an outcome for such a politically charged crisis. High-speed muddling through will be the order of the day for the next year in Europe as arrangements continue to be patched together to maintain the single currency. There will come a point when intramural negotiations will need to take a more formal shape, less to articulate policy and more to determine structure. Delaying that moment of quasi-constitutional reckoning may be in the interests of many, while drawing it closer may be the instinct of others. Fashioning an outcome that has a look of permanence about it will be as important as it will be difficult. Geopolitically, the changing internal dynamics of the Middle East and the cause and effects of the announced US rebalancing to Asia were the most important issues this year. The future regional balance of power in the Levant is the most delicate. President Morsi in Egypt has asserted his authority early, yet the internal balance of power and constitutional framework are not yet firmly established. The country is still shaping its post-Mubarak political identity. In these circumstances, it is hard to see Egypt playing its usually hefty regional diplomatic role. That vacuum will be filled by others, including the Gulf states, which with their suspicions of Iran are defining most issues in sectarian terms and responding accordingly. The freelance diplomacy and occasional military assistance undertaken in Syria by various Gulf Cooperation Council states is symptomatic of this reality. The future of the Assad regime may well be dark, but the delay in his quitting the scene, which could be quite long, will further infect the region. Jordan and Lebanon have reason to worry about the stability of their own domestic order as the Syrian state further degenerates. The situation in southern Lebanon is tense as Hezbollah weighs its own options at a time when Syria is internally stressed and Iran under external pressure. The Shia movement is itself asking existential questions, and these could invite unhappy answers. An accidental conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon is an ever-present risk. Finally, the fact that chemical weapons storage depots and associated delivery systems are to be found between Damascus and the Golan Heights makes Syria's border with Israel also troubling. The risk that chemical weapons could fall into the wrong hands and cross borders to others is an important strategic reason why outside powers are right to emphasize a political solution. Danger signs in the Levant are multiplying, and the impact of any of them being realized is high. The region is living day by day. Diplomatic engagement from the outside needs to be as intense. In comparison, the risk scenarios in the Asia-Pacific appear less frenetic and more tightly bound by the economic incentives that most countries have to maintain peace. That restraint on strategic impertinence does not apply to North Korea, and the ability of a third-generation Kim to keep his internal power base intact without engaging in regular external provocation remains unknown. Better understood is that South Korea will feel obliged to respond to any militarily significant challenge. Public opinion will not easily accept that North Korean aggression can only invite magnanimity or diplomatic protest. The need to maintain a deterrent capacity rests on being able to respond and show the risk of the use of force, and that maxim will weigh heavily on South Korean policymakers. While the tensions across the Taiwan Strait remain much diminished, those throughout the South China Sea have risen, with 9 different Chinese agencies responsible for policing and protecting China's expansively drawn interests in the South China Sea. The chance of accidents and conflict between China and the other claimant states is ever present. China has become diplomatically more assertive on the issue and crucially prevented a strong statement by ASEAN on the issue through the pressure it brought to bear on the Cambodian chair. A code of conduct for the South China Sea and ways of enforcing it remains a diplomatic imperative. Movement towards it will partly depend on how confident the new Chinese leadership is as it emerges from a less than smooth transition. The Bo Xilai scandal will have left its marks, but if the result is a very tightly disciplined and smaller Politburo of 7 rather than 9 leaders and a less factionalized ruling order, then the prospect for accelerating domestic reform and keeping regional disputes contained may be stronger. The U.S. pivot to Asia will have irritated China, though it was partly brought on by the strategic demand created by Asian states that are simultaneously excited about China's economic promise and intimidated by its rising power. China's assertiveness in previous years served to legitimize the United States as a resident Asian power for others. In time, the United States will want to develop confidence-building measures with China analogous to those it negotiated in the past with the Soviet Union. An agreement to avoid incidents at sea and to ensure that conflict is limited would be a natural strategic goal for Washington. The Chinese are likely to see such arrangements as offering a seatbelt to a speeding driver, in effect allowing the United States to become less risk-averse. Rules of the road, as between China and its neighbors, or between China and the United States, will be hard to come by, yet they will be a central feature of Asian defense diplomacy in the years ahead. The fascination of the Asian economic success story and interest in the Pacific century has extended powerfully into Latin America. Many economies have done well from the Chinese appetite for resources, but their growth is also a function of better national economic policies. The Latin American Pacific Four of Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru are strengthening their trade relations with each other and are looking outwards. In June 2012, they formed a Pacific Alliance to improve economic integration and organize their policies more effectively towards Asia. Joint trade between the four may soon reach $9 billion, comparing favorably to the $5.5 billion of trade in 2010 between the Mercosur countries of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. For the four countries, soon possibly joined by Panama, moving out of the Brazilian orbit may be an important psychological motivation, but the prize is to be at the forefront of the new South-South trade routes. The financial, economic, and political traffic between leading Asian, Latin American, Middle Eastern, and African states is an important geo-economic trend. The roads on which that traffic is carried remain unpaved, bumpy, and subject to accidents. Tensions, for example, between Brazil and China over trade dumping and currency manipulation have been high. As China, India, Brazil, and others claim greater extra-regional influence, their interests could well diverge as often as they coalesce. Their small neighbors may also want to protect themselves from potential regional dominance. And in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, many smaller powers are developing their diplomatic independence and flair. Outside powers cannot count on dealing principally with regional champions, Brazil in Latin America, or Egypt in the Levant, or Nigeria in Africa, as a diversity of regional international relations increases. International diplomacy is much more complex. With the rising powers uncertain about how to develop a genuinely global agenda, and the United States preferring to let regional powers take the lead where possible, strategic nationalism continues to rise. In almost every region of the world, countries are now putting their faith as much in self-reliance as in the effectiveness of their regional organizations. National hedging against the failure of regional institutions is as prevalent in the security realm as it is in the financial. For most governments, in fact, foreign policy has become a mixture of political risk management and trade promotion. Shaping favorably the domestic politics of other countries is still an ambition of the greater powers, but its labor-intensive nature leaves most jobs incomplete. Nation building at home is the announced priority of all those who have in the past embarked on it abroad. The tendency now is for a more defensive foreign policy approach. As world politics becomes more global, leadership priorities have become more parochial. There may be a global power shift going on, but the transition will be a long one, and those gaining a greater share of global power have no obvious plan for how they will use it. In that transition and during that shift, private forces will have more of a say and more of an impact. Public policy responses cannot now fall only on the narrowing shoulders of government. Companies acting abroad need to go beyond corporate social responsibility and develop virtual foreign policies if they are to protect their interests and the environments in which they succeed. The media and NGOs who are active internationally are now expected to assume greater responsibility for the impact of their actions. In the age of privatized power, with so many international agencies of power, we are witnessing the privatization of foreign policy. For states to deliver effective foreign policies for their citizens, their approach then has to be even more strategic. Given the need to act so quickly nowadays, some may think strategic thinking a conceit or a luxury, but its absence can certainly be dangerous. As economic houses are being reconstructed in the West and quickly being developed in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the need for a strategic perspective has increased. And naturally, the IISS recommends Strategic Survey 2012 as background reading in that context. We look forward to your questions. Aria.
Thank you. Bari Alameddin, Al Hayat newspaper. It was very interesting that you have not mentioned at all Iran in your review. I thought it would be. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the possibility of a strike by Israel, which everybody's talking about, and the effect that would, of course, have on Lebanon, etc. And you also mentioned Hezbollah and an accident there. Another point is you seem to allude that Assad will be there for a while, or the conflict is going to be there for some time. So I don't know if you would like to elaborate on that as well. Thank you.
Well, we cover Iran and Syria a great deal in Strategic Survey. On the Iranian question, could I ask Mark Fitzpatrick, and then when he's finished, Emil Hokaim on Syria. Mark.
Yes. There is still a possibility of an Israeli strike this autumn, but it's a reduced possibility given the divergence of view in Israel. The signals coming from Israel in the last couple weeks here, on the one hand, Ehud Barak, the defense minister, a changed tone, emphasizing more now his appreciation of America's defense commitments and a implicit acknowledgement of President Obama's commitment to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday coming out very forcefully again, saying that Obama's commitment is not credible. So I myself characterize the latter as being a show of frustration. There's not a consensus within the Israeli Inner Security Cabinet for a strike, and so it's unlikely. The latest IAEA report gave some ammunition to those who advocate prompt action because of the growing stockpile and the growing number of centrifuges in the Fordow plant, which is too deep for Israel to hit. But on the other hand, Iran converted half of its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium to oxide form for use in fuel, putting it out of reach of weapons for the time being. So I think Iran is trying to calibrate so as not to induce a strike. But as the stockpile grows over the coming months, we may get to a point next year where this question of a strike again becomes a kind of a tipping point question. How advanced can Iran's program get before concerned countries decide that preemption is necessary?
Emil Hokaim?
Yeah, thank you. On the question of the resilience of the Assad regime, first the IISS put out yesterday the strategic comments on the issue, looking at the military dimension of the conflict and prospects for intervention. The reality is that many have underestimated the capacity of the Assad regime to survive and strike back. And the resilience of that regime was best illustrated by its capacities to survive the July 18 bombings that removed Al-Shaka, among other security chiefs, and to also survive many defections, including that of Riyad Hijab, the prime minister. Although this last one was more of a symbolic setback because power doesn't reside in the formal institution of the state. President Assad also made a revealing comment just a couple of weeks ago in a TV interview when he talked about a self-cleansing process, that the regime could survive all these defections and desertions because it was in a way cleaning itself. And what this means is that he can now rely on a more dependable, therefore more deployable security force, and has to worry less about the political downsides of his own operations. So I think that he still has what it takes to survive a bit longer than most people think. Now there is a danger, an analytical danger to overread, the significance or overstate the significance of the military setbacks or successes of either the rebels or the opposition. The game is still fundamentally political. It's still about obtaining the shift in loyalties of key social and minority groups across the country. And both Assad and many of the rebel groups seems to have forgotten that. This is why we have gotten to that situation of stalemate. And Aleppo is really an example of that. Aleppo is Syria's largest city, and there was a fight to liberate it starting July, and it has turned into a war of attrition, nasty urban warfare. I mean, half of the city is in rebel hands and the other half in the regime's hand, but there is no prospect for an immediate solution there. But my final point here is that Assad can stop or slow down the downward slide of his regime, but he cannot decisively reverse it. And this is why, I agree with the general consensus that his demise is pretty much inevitable, but it's going to be a very protracted struggle, and you shouldn't assume that it's a matter of weeks or months, as some people, said. He's not yet a dead man walking.
Go ahead. Yes. Wait till the microphone yeah. And could I remind my colleagues that when the red button is up, your microphone is on. If you press it down, you're turning it off.
Thank you. Ali Bahajib, North-South Publications. In your presentation, there was no mention of terrorism, and yet there is a growing trend in North Africa, in particular in the Sahel and in northern Nigeria, of the terrorism threats in there. I wonder if you could elaborate on that and the perspective on the region in particular.
Yeah.
And the second question, if I may, the uncertainty over the withdrawal of NATO's forces in Afghanistan is a major concern to everyone, whether they are partners with NATO or the regional powers in the region as well. Can you please elaborate on that as well? Thank you.
Well, going in reverse order, perhaps on Afghanistan and NATO, I'll ask Ben Barry, and then if Emile, you want to say a few words on terrorism. Let me also again reassure you, we cover the problems in Mali and North Africa quite extensively in the book itself. But don't press it down, keep it up.
The IISS published an Adelphi book earlier this year, which was a comprehensive assessment of the Afghan conflict in all its dimensions. And we came to the view that the most likely outcome was that in 2015, after NATO has withdrawn from the combat role, the Afghan government will survive and its writ will run through the majority of the country. There'll be a patchwork of security, but the areas that over the recent years of the US surge have been cleared and held are likely to remain under Afghan government control. I think the other factor that we need to consider is when you look at Afghanistan's neighbours, none of them have an interest in an unstable Afghanistan. They all actually have an interest in a prosperous Afghanistan, an Afghanistan that's not an exporter of drugs, and that also is not a haven for al-Qaeda and international terrorism in the way that it was. And it seems to me likely that what we'll see over the next few years is a major international diplomatic effort to try and make sure that Afghanistan's neighbours behave as constructively as they can with regard to that country. This is not the early 1990s, immediately after the Soviet withdrawal.
Emile, and perhaps James Hackett might want to add something afterward, but Emile first.
Sure. When it comes to the spread of terrorism in Northern Africa, this is a ripple effect largely a ripple effect of Libya that injected a lot of weaponry into the groups that wanted to operate in the region, and the weakening of the security states in North Africa also played a role in that. There is certainly on the Algerian side and Moroccan side, a strong counterterrorism effort that is also supported by Western states. But in a way, the demise of the Gaddafi regime in particular has had an impact. It had also an impact in the sense that Gaddafi was a patron of a number of groups in neighboring states that now have to look for themselves, to get the resources where they can get them. It's no longer Gaddafi paying for that. So this is playing a role. Interesting thing in Mali is, the focus on the regional solution, that, that there is an onus on that at the moment. The question is whether it is going to happen. Mali is also crossed by many fault lines. It's not just that you have extremist groups that have taken over the northern part of the country. It's that you also had a military coup. You have the Tuareg dimension, etc. So a regional ownership of that problem seems to be emerging, or the question is whether they can deliver. We saw this kind of operation in Somalia and other places where Ethiopia took the lead because there was a terrorism problem. It turned out to be a very painful, bloody operation, but that led to something. I'm not sure it can be replicated in the case of Mali.
James, anything to add?
Just very quickly, I agree with Emil wholeheartedly on the impact of the outflow of weapons from Libya. I think on a more broader sense, it really, the actions of states' armies against terrorist groups raises questions about what are militaries for in sub-Saharan Africa? Are they the best forces used to address counter-terrorist threats? And does acting in this way actually alter the fundamental nature of armed forces? Some of those things are themes we explore in the essay on African defence in the book. On Mali, of course, key date is tomorrow, when I believe ECOWAS chiefs are due to meet to discuss the roadmap for deployment of the ECOWAS standby force into Mali. I think the Malian government's now requested 3,000, and the stated aim, according to ECOWAS, is to address the terrorist threat in the north. It'll be interesting to see if the forces deployed have the capacity and sustaining capability to take that mission forward.
Yes. Okay.
Kim Sen-Gupta from The Independent. Can I ask you something which has just happened, so probably not that easy to analyze cogently? The killing of Chris Stevens and Sean Smith and the two others in Benghazi. Is this an indication of a malaise that might affect the Arab Spring? Is it a Libyan problem, or is it, considering what's been going on in that city, a peculiarly Benghazi problem? And also, is it perhaps an indication of AQ's links now in Libya through Ansar al-Sharia?
Thanks. Emil, AQ in Libya, Benghazi specific?
The details of the attack on the consulate in Benghazi are still unknown. I mean, was it an operation that was prepared before? Was it purely opportunistic? Was it linked to the killing of Yahya al-Libi? I mean, we still have to wait a little bit before making a definitive judgment. But what it does is highlight the very tenuous political situation in Libya, where the process of disarming the militias and building a national army, which has started but not really, is going to face major problems. At the same time, you do have a political process. You did have elections. You did have the appointment of the election of a prime minister yesterday, Shahu. So it's really whether the political elite, which has condemned overwhelmingly the attack on the consulate, because they do realize that it could deal a huge setback to international support of the transition in Libya, and so can assert itself at home. I'm curious to see whether there will be a self-regulating mechanism in Libya, where actually you have groups inside the country that fought, alongside NATO to, free themselves from Gaddafi, who are actually going to participate in rooting out those more extreme elements. I mean, we see those self-regulating mechanisms also in Syria, where, the yearning for international legitimacy is one of the drivers of the behavior of the local rebel groups. The incident may shift the Western perception of what's happening in the Arab world in terms, we already see that in the US, but that would have placed very wrong expectations on the shoulders of the Arab world. These transitions were going to be bloody, painful, complicated. It's worth asking what Chris Stevens, if he were still alive, would have said about the events in Libya. He wouldn't have urged for either revenge or disengagement from the Arab world. To the contrary, he would have argued for renewed investment and attention during those critical periods.
Yes. go ahead, stand up, and the microphone will migrate to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin Benedict from the Associated Press. On the question raised by the previous speaker, can I ask, in a rather more immediate sense, whether you fear that what happened in Libya and the resulting demonstrations in Egypt overnight and today could engulf the rest of the Arab world, specifically in response to the row over the Mohammed film? And secondly, if I may, what impact could a Romney victory in the US elections have on the prospect of a strike against Iran?
Right. Well, Emil on the latter part, and maybe Mark Fitzpatrick, you want to talk about the U.S.-specific question. Emil?
The attacks were tragic, but in a more strategic sense, what matters more is the response from the Libyan and the Egyptian governments and publics to what happened. And this is going to be the real test, and I would say especially in Egypt. Here you have governments in power that are dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And this is a big test in terms of their international credibility. President Morsi took forever to actually make a statement, although he spoke with President Obama yesterday. The Libyan government was much clearer in its condemnation of what happened. And this is in a way the tragedy of your mainstream Islamist movements, is that they can easily be how do you say, Zayd? Sorry, I have the word in Arabic. Outflanked, exactly, thank you. By more extremist factions that frame everything in terms of identity, not in terms of public governance choices, not in terms of the need for international recognition, etc. And if these governments let the extremists set the terms of the debate, then it's going to be extremely complicated for the West to justify at home a deep involvement and continued relationship with Egypt and Libya, etc. Now, I tend to be more on the optimistic side. I mean, we saw a relatively positive reaction both in Libya and Egypt to what happened. And there is a good understanding, I think, especially on the American side, that it's not the time to inflame that. Although, the fact that we're in the middle of a presidential election in the U.S. may set the terms of the debate there. Let's remember one of the issues that's on the table in the U.S. Congress now is debt relief for Egypt. It's $1 billion+, and a $4.5 billion IMF, loan to Egypt, and the U.S. will have to play a role in this. So the question is whether this will play out in U.S. politics.
Mark Fitzpatrick?
Whoever is president next year will have to weigh the relative costs and benefits, the consequences, the effectiveness of a military strike. And the advice they receive from the professionals in the U.S. government will be the same, that a strike will not root out Iran's nuclear program. It would delay it by a period of time. Of course, an American-led strike would delay for a much longer time than a unilateral strike by Israel. The effectiveness, though, will still be time-limited, and the consequences, well, there are various guesses, not always predictable, but certainly consequential. Mitt Romney has kept open his options of what he would do, but his advisors have leaned much more toward the strike range of options. When Mitt Romney was in Israel, his senior advisor, Dan Senor, aligned himself very closely with the Netanyahu position in terms of a red line, that Iran should be prevented from obtaining a nuclear weapons capability. That's the way that Netanyahu expresses it. Whereas President Obama has talked in terms of preventing Iran from becoming nuclear armed. So a difference between capability and production. But capability is not any one single point. It's a continuum. I think if Mitt Romney becomes president, he'll have a range of advisors who will debate along that continuum.
Yep. I'll come back to you. Sorry, James. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. Alex Stevenson from politics.co.uk, based in Westminster, where many Conservative Eurosceptic MPs might be questioning an assumption, a suggestion that you made, which was that the UK and others can't use the crisis to renegotiate their relationship with the Eurozone. I think they'd be asking, why not?
I'm sure that's exactly what they would be asking. The question that the Prime Minister will have to take as to when is the most propitious time to discuss the nature of the UK relationship with and in Europe. As I said in my statement, the instinct of some will be to delay that moment, and the instinct of others would be to accelerate that moment. And we heard Mr. Barroso yesterday accelerating that moment and calling for a European federation and using the word constitution in his remarks, and effectively saying that this move would have to be regulated by a new constitutional dispensation. Everybody who has in the past negotiated EU constitutions knows that this is not a process that is done overnight. It takes months and years, and the ratification of a new constitutional dispensation can have its ups, downs, and delays. So I think the right moment to begin talking about what would be a new relationship with the European Union would be at a time when there is an actual negotiation of that in a formal sense within the EU itself. The time for that will not be short, but I don't think it's something that can be delayed for a matter of many years either. So we're just alerting our international audience to the fact that while there is necessary and urgent crisis management activity around the question of the euro itself, the constitutional debate cannot be eternally delayed. James Blitz.
Blitz, Financial Times. Can I draw you back to what seemed to be your concluding theme in your introduction, which is the privatization of foreign policy? And I just wondered if you could expand on that a bit. You seem to be saying that in future, or at the moment, policy is driven more and more by economic, financial actors, major companies, rather than by nation states. Can you say a bit more about that? Because it does seem to be your major theme this year, or one of them anyway.
Well, I think many of the questions this morning have demonstrated how the activity of private actors suddenly can have a major impact on international affairs and the relations between states, any kind of private actor. Since the 1970s, people have talked about the role of multinationals in international affairs, but I think the role that foreign companies now have potentially in the internal politics of countries is even huger. And we saw, in fact, during the Arab Spring, many companies having to think about how they were to react in a political sense to the Arab Spring. At one point, Vodafone agreed with President Mubarak's request to disallow texting. When they came back to texting, they only allowed for a brief period Egyptian government text. Google, on the other hand, had a speak to tweet function, which then allowed people to, by sending messages to their voicemail, get access to Twitter and carry out their private diplomacy within Egypt through that method. Siemens has had questions asked of it about the way in which it engages in Iran. We know also about the long stories of Google and China. And it's, of course, not only in the telecommunications space, classically in the natural resources space as well. Companies need to understand the internal politics of states in a much more impressive way than in the past. Look at the way in which Repsol in Argentina had excellent relations with the previous Kirchner government because of the way that it aligned itself with a business family that was close to the Kirchner family. But that relationship broke down when the wife of Mr. Kirchner had a different relationship with that family, and Repsol's equity in Argentina was grabbed by the state. So I think what we are pointing out is that is almost axiomatically obvious that in an age of globalization there are many actors in international affairs, and in the same way as countries have lost the monopoly on the organized use of force, they are beginning to lose also a monopoly on the exercise of foreign policy, and the public-private sector partnership in this area is as important as in others.
Hello, I'm Bijan Farhoudia, Voice of America in London. I have two questions, one on Iran and one on Iran and Syria. On Iran, due to sanctions, the Iranian economy is under tremendous pressure, high unemployment, high inflation, and people are very upset. The national currency has lost more than half of its value. Do you envisage, because of the sanctions and the pressures the Iranian public are facing, there could be an economic meltdown in Iran, and could that cause a social revolt against the government? And the second question is on Iran and Syria. To what extent do you think the Iranian support is helping Bashar Assad to cling to power? And if Assad falls, what would be the ramifications for Iran, its strongest ally in the area?
Thanks very much. Well, just to begin by saying, if you turn to page 61 of Strategic Survey this year, we have a 15-page appreciation of the impact of the economic sanctions on Iran. So that is, I think, something you might want to review. On the Iran-Syria relationship, Emil Hukayem, and then on the Iranian economy. Mark, would you like to take that?
Yes.
So Emil first.
The signs that Iran is very seriously supporting Assad are very significant. Everything from oil sales to shipments of weaponry. There are reports that actually weaponry is making it through the air from Tehran to Damascus. The Syrian rebels allege that they have captured at least 48 IRGC personnel who have landed months ago in Damascus. They caught them on the way from the airport to barracks in town. Ayatollah Khamenei 2 weeks ago during the non-aligned summit, reasserted his support for the Assad regime. Qasem Soleimani visited Damascus a few times. I think it's difficult to underestimate or understate the support that Iran is providing to Assad. Now, after all, this is a 3-decade-long alliance. And they've become brother-in-arms in a way. And now the problem really is the political, financial, strategic cost for Iran down the road. I mean, think about it. This is 30 years of investment and resources and political capital in allies that have turned out either to be unstable, like Syria, or unreliable, like Hamas. That's shift. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was a strategic debate happening in Tehran now about whether it is worth pouring down all that money and all that political capital in this issue. Now, the problem for Iran is it doesn't have an easy option to reorient its foreign policy. What does it in security policy? What does it do? It double down on its nuclear program or its indigenous capabilities? It's easier said than done. Or it drops its influence and its presence in the Levant and refocuses on the Persian Gulf, well, that would mean actually that the tensions are going to be even more sectarian, because Iran's role in the Levant is seen as a way to diffuse its sectarian image, that Iran stands up for Arab and Muslim causes that Arab states have abandoned. So that helps allay the stigma associated with Iran being a Shia power. But certainly there is a strategic debate within Iran, and I don't think it's inevitable that Iran will go down with Assad, will maintain its support as Assad goes down.
Mark?
The sanctions are not designed to create an economic meltdown for Iran. They're aimed to try to change Iran's calculus, which they haven't yet. The economy is not facing a meltdown, but it is under severe pressure. Iran is losing $3.5 billion a month of oil sales. It has in reserve about $80 billion to $100 billion. If you do the math, they could last for another 20 months before they run out of reserves. What has probably got to be of concern to the government in Iran, though, is not that the economy is melting down, but that there's a growing anger and discontent among households who see inflation officially at 23%, but unofficially double that. And as you say, the price of the real losing half of its value earlier this year and being in free fall in the last week. The regime has to be worried that this kind of discontent could lead to anger expressed in different ways. It hasn't so far. There's no evidence of protest in the street. The Green Revolution has been invisible for the last couple of years, but events in the Middle East have a tendency to emerge suddenly. How the Syria situation affects, I think, on the one hand, it will contribute to Iran's sense of isolation, although they still portray themselves as the victors of the Arab Spring. But it could also contribute to a sense of, without a means of power extension through Syria to Lebanon, that Iran has to rely more on its nuclear option.
Yes, in the second row, thanks.
Jonathan Rugman from Channel 4 News. Ben Barry painted quite an optimistic picture of Afghanistan, talking about it being in the region's interest for peace, but the region doesn't necessarily have the same definition of its interests as we do. And I wondered how you thought the relationship between the US and Pakistan was likely to develop, given there seems to be a running out of patience, the barring of the Haqqani network, for example. And secondly, on the question of newly emerging powers not being quite sure what to do with that power, what does the fallout between Russia and China and Britain and others at the Security Council, what are the long-term consequences of that?
Okay. On the first question, Ben, you were asked to say a few words, but I think Rahul Roy Chowdhury might come in afterwards on the US-Pakistan relationship. So if you want to begin, Ben.
On the military side, clearly there's great tension with US claims that Pakistan is not adequately countering the Haqqani network in its base areas in North Waziristan, and Pakistan's understandable intolerance of US drone strikes against al-Qaeda. But of course, what we have seen is the Pakistani government choosing to back down on its closure of the lines of communication for NATO troops in Afghanistan through Pakistan, something that will be extremely useful for the NATO military withdrawal. But on the political issues, I defer to Rahul.
Thank you. I mean, we've seen in the last 24 months or so the worst period of relationships between the US and Pakistan. And I think there is clearly a sign in both governments that relations need to be improved bilaterally. Now that's not very easy to do. There is unprecedented trust deficit between the two countries, especially after the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Nonetheless, both the US and Pakistan have a clear interest in terms of the future stability of Afghanistan. For the US, particularly in terms of the withdrawal of its troops in the next few months and years. For Pakistan, clearly a sense that it needs a sense of stability in Afghanistan, in the absence of which there could well be a blowback within Pakistan's domestic politics, particularly in terms of the relationship among the Pashtun community across the Afghan-Pakistan border. So, in essence, I think clearly there are opportunities for both the US and Pakistan to work together, but it is going to be a very difficult road to travel on, precisely because of the lack of trust that there is today between the two countries.
On the broader question about Russia, China, and the Security Council, perhaps Nick Redmond might want to say a few words on that.
Thank you. Well, it's been quite a long-running narrative, actually, disagreement at the Security Council. I think the Libya abstention by Russia was actually the exception rather than any sort of break, and perhaps also the last truly independent act of the Medvedev presidency. Looking at it from a slightly longer-term perspective, The biggest rupture, of course, actually came when the US and British governments actually decided to completely sideline the Security Council and invade Iraq. So as long as Western states are mostly trying to work through the Security Council, albeit, as we've seen in the cases of Iran and Libya, also engaging in fora other than the Security Council, particularly in order to tighten sanctions, then at least the scope for conflict there is limited. My reading of the Putin administration is basically it's fairly pragmatic. If there's deals to be done, they will be done.
Okay. Oh, I'd actually promised you first, so why don't we come back to you and in the front row. Go ahead. So sorry.
Thank you very much. Wei Sun with the Global Times, a leading newspaper in China. The Japanese government's nationalization of Diaoyu Island has further irritated China. So do you think it will lead to an escalation of tension between these two countries? In what way it will be resolved? Thank you.
Tim Huxley, after Japan bought some islands. Tim.
The upsurge in disputes over maritime territory is one of the key features of the Asia-Pacific security scene at the moment. We have a combination of long-standing unresolved disputes over maritime boundaries, increasing interest in securing control over maritime resources, including fisheries as well as oil and gas, and efforts by states in the region to build up their naval capabilities and also their paramilitary maritime security forces, coast guards, and so on. So we have seen over the last year or two disputes not just between Japan and China, but also between Japan and Korea, and also between Korea and China, and in the South China Sea between China and Vietnam and the Philippines and other claimants there. These disputes, I think, are dangerous, and they are also likely to be extremely difficult to resolve. I think the best that can be hoped for in the medium term is to find some way of managing these maritime tensions to prevent them from escalating out of control. And you allude to particular developments between China and Japan, and I think there are real dangers there. But I think a resolution is still a long way off.
Right, back in the front row then, and then the next one at the back. Yep, you'll come next. And you, Charlie.
Thank you. Andrew Swiedlicki from the Polish news agency. I have a question on the Eurozone. How do you see relations developing between the Eurozone members and non-Eurozone members in the context of saving the euro, and how will it affect the new members of the European Union?
Alex Nichol.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think John referred to one aspect of this. But I think one should also consider what might happen if the euro survives. I mean, my observation would be that during these, couple of years of crisis, all the time there have been sort of very shrill forecasts about the whole thing falling apart. But when it's come to the crunch, and it's come to the crunch a number of times, governments have in fact done enough to keep the euro kind of on the rails. And in the book, we in fact list all the various things that have been done, some by individual countries, some collectively, and the last one, in fact, was last week with the European Central Bank giving its additional weight to the solution of the crisis. So it seems to indicate to me that there is, in fact, the political will, even in the countries that are most affected, to keep the euro going, to stay in the euro. of course, their accidents can still happen. But I do think that one should start to consider, if this crisis actually abates, and in the end we do get some economic growth in Europe, which is the really essential ingredient that we don't have right now. What will be the political implications and strategic implications of that? We then will have a very strong central role for Germany in the future of Europe and the surrounding area too. And we will have also a Europe that's tied much more closely together, both politically and economically. So I think that one should consider that possibility.
Yes, you in the aisle. Yes, and then the back, and then Jonathan Marcus after.
I'm Thorsten Huhn from ARD German Radio. My question is in the same direction. How will be the relationship between the Eurozone countries and the other EU countries, especially Britain? I see a movement here to get away from Europe. How can be the relationship tomorrow? What do you think?
Alex?
I mean, Britain has had, as everybody knows, a very ambivalent relationship with Europe for decades now. And personally, I just see that continuing. Of course, there will always be agitation in the Conservative Party to do something different. But even Conservative prime ministers have, in fact, gone along with, when it's come to sort of big agreements, they've gone along with them. They've reached compromises which they've judged to be in the best interests of Britain. The fiscal compact that was agreed to last December, as far as I remember, as far as I remember, all European countries, all, say, European Union members went along with that, apart from Britain. And Britain's opposition to it, in fact, really in the end didn't mean anything. So, I think that, the relationships, the difficult relationships that there have been will simply continue, and governments must judge when it comes to the really big agreements, the really big decisions, what is in their best interest. So far, they've actually stuck with the Euro and the European Union. Well, for new members, of course, there have been all sorts of political imperatives making it very attractive for them to be in the European Union, and I don't see that interest changes.
Back row. Yep.
Thank you. Salam Sarhan, Al Arab Daily. I want to put some light on, in the light of the film and what happened in Libya. Is this going to impact the freedom of expression in Europe? The official policy. We saw what happened in Denmark and in North Europe, and lots of movement among the civil society to protect the freedom of speech. Thank you.
The question about how European activities freedom of expression. Adam Ward.
No, I think is the answer to that.
I knew there would be a one-word answer. It was just a question of who was going to provide it, really. In the row. Yes, you, madam. Yeah, and then Jonathan Marcus.
Judith from Spanish international news agency Agencia EFE. Going quickly back to the Euro question, what's the potential for social unrest in the countries that are being imposed severe austerity measures?
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is potential. We've seen, violence in Greece, and of course, we can see severe discontent in other countries, and that's inevitable when you get recessions as deep and affecting particular sectors, as we're seeing. As I said, I think the essential ingredient that's missing right now is growth, and growth can only come from a kind of resurgence of confidence. How you create that confidence, I think, is a long-term process. It's clearly not something you can just snap your fingers and create economic confidence that enables people to invest, to borrow, to lend. It takes time. Obviously, the hope of Chancellor Merkel is that the the step-by-step process that she's kind of overseen, both collectively and in individual countries, is in the end going to work, that will create more healthy economies which have longer-term confidence in their longer-term future. Of course, a lot of people think that she's wrong and that much more radical measures should be taken to stimulate growth right now. It's a debate that's going on. I certainly don't have the answer to it.
Last question, Jonathan Marcus.
Jonathan Marcus, BBC. Question back to the Middle East. Mr. Obama last night in an interview apparently uttered the interesting sentence that Egypt was neither an ally of the United States nor an enemy. Do you think this is a phrase which is designed to, with regard to the sensitivities of the new Egyptian government, or is it an indication of a much more fundamental shift in American policy in the region?
I'll give Emil a crack first, and if Mark wanted to say anything, then Mark. But Emil?
President Obama has been accused in the U.S. of being a secret Muslim Brotherhood supporter. So, at least with this comment, he squashed that, that perception. I think by doing this, he's signaling to a number of audiences that, the U.S. cannot be taken for granted during those transitions. I think in a way to build real leverage over the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. The downgrade from ally to what I've heard this morning, partner, is that in a way a welcome one. It puts Egypt's the responsibility to move Egypt forward squarely on Egyptian shoulders. It really dampens expectations about what the U.S. can and deliver, given current fiscal and other constraints. But fundamentally, I do believe that there is a general fatigue in the U.S. and elsewhere with involvement in the Middle East. There is a sense that Arab publics are ungrateful for what they're getting. Now, it's debatable whether this is a fair perception, but this is certainly part of the growing narrative right now. Whether this will last, I don't know. I mean, it's worth remembering that there is a pretty large chunk of the Republican Party that is actually more arguing for more intervention in the Middle East rather than complete disengagement. They may not be on the upswing right now, but that faction may drag the U.S. back into Iran or intervene elsewhere because of counterterrorism reasons, etc. But the romance of intervention in the region has certainly worn off, and I think Syrians are going to be the first to pay the price for it, because prospects for intervention have really suffered from what happened in the past 2 days.
Many thanks. The volume strategic survey is available outside, as is the press statement that I delivered, but also you might want to look at the strategic comment that we issued this morning on Syria that you can also pick up. Thank you very much.